Hi, this is Dasha, and this is day 13, episode 13 of the Talking to the Camera challenge. I was in a very reminiscent mood today, so I thought I could talk about Russian schools. So, the kinds of Russian schools that I've been to myself until I was 13. I've gone to 2 Russian schools. Just in general, what the education looks like, what the program is like, what's the dynamic between teachers and students, all of that stuff. What do students do in their break time? Mainly just the attitudes and the behaviors that you encounter in Russian schools rather than the technical aspect of what exactly is studied. But because I've myself been to primary and middle school in Russia, I thought it could be interesting to just expand on it a little bit. The one thing that's very different from British schools is that in Russian schools there is no uniforms, or in most Russian schools there are no uniforms that kids wear. We could just wear whatever clothes we wanted to school. That didn't really create bullying from what I remember, but maybe I was lucky and maybe I just went to schools where kids were, taught well about not commenting on each other's appearance. So I personally never saw a problem with not having a uniform at school. So when I came to the UK for the first time, wearing a uniform was something new to me. I got used to it and I decided that it had some benefits as well. But yeah, in Russian schools, whenever wore uniforms, usually it was just, jeans and either a turtleneck or a t-shirt, depending on the weather. Girls sometimes could wear dresses. It was very casual clothes that we would wear. There was no particular dress code for students either. I do remember that my mom used to always insist on me having my hair tied back, but that's just because she thought that it would be uncomfortable for me to, write stuff while leaning down, the hair getting in my face. So I always had my hair tied back in a ponytail, and I guess she was right. But it was not a requirement for students, for girls in general, to have a certain hairstyle. Unfortunately, from memory, in every school that I'd been, in every class that I'd sat, teachers would always have favorites and what would be considered outcasts. So kids they liked more and kids they liked less. And you could see in the treatment of students who was a teacher's pet and who was not so liked by your teacher. One of the teachers we had, she was teaching us correct speech in primary school. She had a favorite among us just because that girl was a Capricorn. Apparently the zodiac sign was important to that woman, and she would always call her my little favorite Capricorn in front of the whole class. And we really hated that, but yeah, that was just what it was. The teacher really favorited her, just based on the zodiac sign, which right now I'm thinking about it, it's funny for me to say. It's funny that something like that could be a criteria even. At the same time, I remember when we were 10 or 11 years old, so I guess that was beginning of middle school, we had Russian literature classes, and our Russian lit teacher really didn't like one of the students that we had. It was a boy in our class, and sometimes he lacked attention during class, and I don't think that was his fault because guys at that age, 10, 11, 12, they're usually all over the place and find it hard to concentrate. But for some reason, she decided to make it known to the whole class. In one of the lessons, that boy was writing in his diary instead of listening to her, and she took the diary, she confiscated it, but also decided that it was a good idea to read everything he wrote in there during her lesson to the whole class. That was devastating to hear. Very humiliating for him, of course, as well. That is just the kind of attitude that some teachers had, some sort of payback for you not listening in their class or not being focused enough or not having good enough results. So I guess this teacher decided that the suitable punishment for him would be to expose his privacy in front of all of his classmates. And I do think that I remember him being bullied a little bit, which again was a shame. But that's completely the teacher's fault to feel like it was within her right to set him up like that in front of the whole class. I'm now also thinking about this and seeing it from a fresh angle. At that time, I think for the most kids it was just funny. but you can't really judge these situations accurately when you're a kid. But because teachers are adults, I do believe that they have a responsibility to treat kids fairly, to treat them in a right way, to make sure that they're learning and that they're encouraged and motivated to learn rather than forced. But those two cases really stuck with me because it really illustrates well that majority of teachers would have their favorites and their outcasts in the class. And that's just because in Russia you don't become a teacher because that's something very prestigious, or you really want to be a teacher, or you really like kids. Most people become teachers just because they feel like they have no other option. They feel like their education doesn't let them choose any other profession that will have a better pay-time ratio. It's also very common for teachers to exert blind authority over students, and they expect students to do everything word for word without questioning any of the so-called orders that are given. Nothing that a teacher says can usually be questioned. You often hear phrases like, "You'll do that because I said so," or "because nothing." There is no particular thought process that is encouraged or, analysis. It's just the blind adherence to what the teacher says, to the school rules, without any questioning or any objection, just because you've been told so. That develops a culture of fear, that develops a culture of fear of punishment and fear of consequences. And I guess the teachers behave that way because they have to blindly adhere to those above them, like the school headmaster or vice headmaster, or whoever it is who manages them in the school hierarchy. So this kind of blind adherence, the students are at the very bottom level of this, then it is the teachers, and then it is the school management. I'll say here though that I am generalizing, and the picture that I'm describing is suitable to an average Russian school, but in every school, in every kind of educational establishment, you will find teachers and professors who are really great at what they do. They're really great at working with kids, which is rare again in Russian schools, but possible. And personally, I've had a few teachers like that. Mostly they were language teachers, hence I developed a really passion for languages, and that became one of my favorite subjects at school just because I was lucky with my English language teachers, French language teachers, and so on. When it comes to the actual learning process in Russia, at least when we're talking about primary and middle school, because I've never been to high school in Russia, but from what memory tells me, I think the distinctive feature of Russian education is that it's based on memorizing rather than analyzing. And it's super important because it means that kids actually just use their memory to blindly remember some rules or, some poems without trying to analyze or explain it to themselves, without gaining a deeper understanding of what they're actually learning. So this memory-based kind of learning process is very much in the core of Russian primary and middle school education. It was a big change for me when I came to the UK, and I've realized that the essays that we're writing are actually based on the analysis of information. For example, history or English Lit, it was about our own perception, our understanding, comparing the arguments of different historians, for example. All of that I've never done in a Russian school before, so it was a steep learning curve for me. I had to pick up a lot, but yes, that's definitely something that I've noticed that was present in British education system, but not in Russian one, the analysis and critical kind of analysis of information. But yeah, that's definitely something that I've seen in British schools, but not in Russian schools. The encouragement to critically assess and analyze the information that you're given, that you're taught. Cheating is at the very heart of, the student spirit in Russian schools. And I've seen Russian students cheat much more than I've seen British students do. And this kind of cheating is because the grade is valued much more, the result of the test is valued much more than the knowledge that you gain. And aside from that, the more elaborate are the ways in which you can cheat at tests or, exams, mock exams at schools in Russia, the more respect you will gain from your Russian classmates. Because they will be amazed at your skillfulness, so-called. I remember there were so many ways in which we would cheat at tests. A friend of mine even, I remember, once stuck a cheat sheet on the sole of his shoe. So he would be sat with his ankle resting on his knee and just kind of looking down, checking the answers on the sole of his shoe and copying them into the exam sheet. And the teacher noticed that he was copying from somewhere, but she would be ordering him to stand up, to look through his pockets to see if he had any cheat sheets, and obviously he stood up on the cheat sheet that stuck on the sole of his shoe. So she didn't see this, she didn't discover it. The whole class was really impressed. So you get this recognition from your classmates for cheating, for doing something dishonest, and therefore the culture of cheating kind of keeps blooming. I guess in middle school and primary school it's not that important, but as you approach to high school, where some really important exams are actually taking place, the culture of cheating can really bring you down, because either you can get caught or, you know, there might be situations where it's just the surveillance during the exam is so harsh that it's not possible to bring a cheat sheet or, you know, your mobile phone into the classroom for the exam. So the consequences can be quite devastating if you haven't prepared and relied on cheating, and you were just not given this opportunity, or if you found one, then it's very easy to get caught. In terms of the social kind of dynamic just between students, usually kids divide into some sort of groups in a class. There are usually up to 30-40 kids in one class, and they divide into some sort of friend groups, and these friend groups are usually really tight. I have heard of bullying cases, quite severe bullying cases in Russian schools, but I was lucky enough to either go to schools where that was just not the case, or, you know, encounter students that were nicer than the cases I've heard about verbal abuse and even physical abuse. Obviously, at the age of 10, 11, 12, kids can be quite cruel, so everybody is bound to encounter a few unpleasant moments and a few frictions in their social circles while at that age and at school. But I do know that Russian kind of bullying can get quite severe, especially in public schools, and teachers don't necessarily pay attention to that. Personally, I only remember a couple of times when I was bullied in a school in Russia, but luckily I was able to stand up for myself and my friends were able to stand up for me. So I wouldn't say that I've endured some sort of trauma from that. I only remember it as a matter of fact rather than as something super traumatic for me. I guess it depends on what school you went to and what students you surrounded yourself with, but usually it's the boys teasing girls that's the biggest problem. The boys locking girls in boys' bathrooms and similar situations that I'd heard of, but luckily never experienced myself. But otherwise, in those kind of social groups that get formed in a class of 30-40 kids, there can be up to maybe 4, 5, 6 groups like that. The relationships that the kids form, the friendships that they form, are usually very tight, and they rely on shared interests and hobbies. At least from what I remember, for between class, you know, so-called entertainment that we created for ourselves, it was popular to create so-called clubs of interests where we would just discuss stuff that we would be into at that point. It could be music bands, it could be books that we read, it could be comics that we read, and those clubs of interest would be the main kind of social glue that kept the groups together, because we would have something in common to talk about in between breaks. But those clubs are more common for primary school up to maybe 10 years old. Once we grew slightly older, it was maybe 12, 13, that kind of age, it became popular to write, at least between girls. It became popular to write short stories, to write what was planned to be novels. We would just bring our notebooks with us and just write whole chapters of whatever it was that our imagination spat out, and shared it between us. And that was kind of a big hobby in 2000, whatever it was, 2010 maybe? yeah, 2009, 2010, 2011, those were the years we would be really into writing. But I guess the biggest unspoken rule in the social circles in Russian schools would be not to rat each other out and to cover for each other, because students who would tell on other students to teachers or anyone superior or their parents would be considered rats. We would call them rats, and they would get bullied a lot. I do remember that they would get bullied a lot. That's just the culture of protecting each other and putting your peers above your superiors. I am not sure how healthy that culture was. Of course, telling on somebody, especially if that someone is your friend, is not a nice thing to do, because you know that you will get them in trouble. But at the same time, covering for each other often came at the cost of suffering yourself. Even if it was someone else's fault and you had to take the blame for it, the teacher blamed you for it, you couldn't tell on them to save yourself. And if you did tell on somebody, then the punishment from, you know, the kids around you would be very severe. You would be boycotted, you could get hit. It was just something that was really not tolerated. In primary and middle school, when I was a student, obviously. I'm not sure whether it's still the case right now in Russia, but something tells me that that part of the Russian school kind of experience will never change, or not in the near future. But at the same time, because of this don't tell on each other culture, because of this covering for each other culture, there was a lot of trust between friends at school. You could tell them anything and know that it's safe with them. Whether or not you'd be breaking the rules, you knew that you could confide in your friend group and it would just stay within that group and won't go any further. And that's exactly why when kids would cheat at tests, they would only gain respect from their peers, from the kids around them, rather than any kind of harsher consequences, just because nobody felt the need to go and tell on you to the teacher. Everybody was just amazed at how amazing you were at breaking the rules. And that was a theme for me throughout the first 6 years of my education, probably 7 years of my education, until I came to a British school. It was quite a unique experience to study in schools in two countries. I was able to compare how similar and how different they are, how relationships are formed between students or between teachers and their students. British schools were much more formal and much more kind of abiding to the rules, and encouraged much more thought, and that thinking process was analytical rather than kind of blind adherence to whatever you were told. So it was quite a different experience for me, but I'm glad I was able to experience both. I feel like it enriched my mind to have experienced both, because now I understand the culture in Russian education versus British education, and it's kind of cool to have participated in both. I hope it was interesting to have this little insight. It was certainly interesting for me to reminisce. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Tomorrow is Valentine's, so hopefully it'll be something along that theme. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Bye.